not end the year in a deficit. Now, what that could be, though, Ryan, is a combination of, some level of classified cuts for fiscal 21 and then some additional cuts in 22. But you're right. We would have to address that $9.3 million deficit in fiscal 22. We could not start the year. That would be pretty significant. So you got to figure if we have, and I'm trying to swap this out here. If we tend to use like say $75,000 for an average for an employee on an annual basis, so that'd be 133 staff people. 80% of the budget is salaries and benefits for staff. So, you really, there's not a whole lot of tweaking you can do in terms of, paper and supplies and, professional development. In fact, a lot of that we've already really pulled down with this last $2.5 million that we just cut. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at people, and for $10 million, that's a lot of people. So and I'm assuming that would be a mix of staff people across the district, both certified, classified, administrative, all kinds of things.
So that's, just looking at the salaries and wages and fringe benefits in the forecast, that's around, 90 million last year, a little less. So we're talking about, 11% taken off that. So, and you're normally cutting, some of the less senior people. So, what we're talking somewhere between 10 and 15% of staff.
Yeah. And that's why you're right, because we typically use the lower salary figure when we do an estimate for how many people, because it is typically done by seniority.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't know, I can't speak for the rest of the members. I just wanted to kind of understand, what happens if we recommend nothing. That's not acceptable to me, what Scott described. To me,
Scott, if I could ask about the transportation, that seems to often be, a suggestion that people make, and that is that you take a look at that and try to somehow cut costs. And rather than making specific suggestions about how to cut it, what would you say is the maximum amount that you would be able to cut, taking into account that probably for the upcoming year, whatever busing you're doing is going to have to also involve social distancing?
Yes. Well, that's a good question. In fact, that's the committee meeting that I just jumped off of to come onto this one is the reentry planning committee meeting, where that group is trying to figure out what to do in terms of what the school year looks like for next year. And so they're offering some suggestions there, but transportation is still a big question mark. One of the surveys that they're discussing in that committee, parents, they sent out a survey to parents asking them, how comfortable do you feel returning to school? Lots of different questions about, what they felt about online learning versus, face-to-face, what they felt about social distancing and how important some of those things were. And don't quote me here. I want to say it was in the high 80s, the percentage of parents who said that they didn't feel comfortable putting their kids back on the bus.
Yes, it was 69%, Scott. I'm on that committee as well.
Was that only 69? Okay, so it wasn't quite
that.
Yeah,
it was 69% for no, and then it had some maybes. So if you combine the no's and the maybes, it was definitely in the 80s.
Okay, so that's where I got that. Good. Thank you, Quatrice, for clarifying that. So yeah, so there's a significant number of parents who don't feel comfortable with their students coming back on the bus. So the question is, what does that look like for transportation? Because remember, we transport as many non-public students as we do our own kids. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions in terms of transportation, what we can save there, if we can save anything. You know, if based on social distancing and the lack of demand, if our current fleet is sufficient to meet the social distancing, you know, guidelines, that's possible. I don't have a good answer for your question, Kathy. Sorry about that.
So let's assume that everything was normal. Has anybody ever tried to estimate how much could be saved by changing to the what is the current? I can't remember now. Is it one
mile? We're at 1 mile.
1 or 1 to 2 miles?
Yeah, going from 1 to 2 miles. That has been, I don't have a figure for that, but that has been looked at by the transportation department at some point in the last couple of years to say what would happen. You know, that's one of the cost savings measures that is typically not popular,
Right.
you know, because it's the younger students having to walk another mile to school, or the lack of transportation, or, you know, available transportation for students, especially when you get into the winter months. But that has been looked at, you know, and it's a few $1 million that's tied up in transportation, you know, to begin with in total. So there are savings to be had there if that kind of a decision was made, but obviously that has some, you know, big impact on families in the district.
Scott, it's nowhere in the neighborhood.
Capital and operating expenses for the transportation department.
I'm sorry, Kathy, one more time.
Does that include capital as well as operating expenses for the transportation department? Does it include, you know, the acquisition and maintenance cost of the buses, for example?
So the buses are typically paid for from PI. So that wouldn't be an operating savings there, but there is maintenance that is included there. So for sure, you know, a smaller fleet would require less maintenance. We do have mechanics and trades who do work on the buses, you know, and also obviously bus drivers. If we had fewer bus drivers, we had to pay.
Would there also be currently some permanent improvement expenses that are paid out of the general fund, so that reducing those expenses for the transportation department might mean that you would have more permanent improvement money that you could use for those costs that were instead being paid out of the operating budget?
Yes, that would be true. Although, you know, George, you know, Petcack, our director of business services, wouldn't want to hear me say that, because, you know, he already is, you know, not always happy with the amount of work that still needs to be done at the various facilities and roofs and parking lots and all those things. And, you know, he has a 5-year plan for the PI dollars. So he's always trying to balance what projects are being done. They're done on, you know, those projects that are most urgent. So he has designs on the PI. So, you know, there's not a lot of shifting that can be done
without
that way.
Right.
Yeah, but you're right. There are some capital costs in the general fund that are probably specifically related to transportation that would go.
The only other question that I have about things that we've heard people talk about for saving money would be selling off buildings. My own experience has been that you get almost nothing doing that, contrary to people's expectations. It seems to me your one really big asset is Wiley, and that is also ultimately in the long run maybe not going to generate all that much money. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, I would agree.
That's not even to speculate about it, but I mean, is that they talk about the facilities that aren't being used. Is that really a potential source of any income?
Right. No, it's a good question, because I get the same one, you know, and in particular about Wiley. And, you know, the one thing that I remind people, which, you know, as from your history, is that, you know, if we do sell that building, you know, whatever proceeds we get has to be put back into capital. It can't be used for operating expenses. So, you know, I think there is a notion that oh, you can sell Wiley for tens of millions of dollars, and then you can take that money and pay teachers or staff or whatever you want to do with it. And that's not the case. Any money that's received for the sale of a building is restricted for capital use, and that's a statutory thing.
And this is Max. Aren't there also restrictions on who you can sell the building to?
It's a process. Kathy could probably speak to that better than I can. She advised us during her years at Squires on a lot of those kinds of matters.
Yeah, it's surprising how quick you forget these things, but the general rule was that all property had to be put up for public auction, but there are a huge number of exceptions to that, so that it's actually fairly rare that a school building is sold at public auction. So you can avoid the auction requirement if you sell it to a political subdivision. And so one way around this is that the school district hasn't done this, but many other school districts have, where they have a willing city, and that is that you convey it to the city. And then the city can do practically anything with the property in terms of, what kind of price they get for it, or selling it at private sale if the purpose is for economic development. So those are some ways to get around it. And then another is that you put it up for public auction, nobody bids, or they don't bid at market value. If that happens, then the school district can then do a negotiated sale with any, for the best price that they can get with anybody. So what's complicated, I'll be honest, what's complicated about it is that it's usually of significant interest to the host city, and that there are community groups that have their, would like to be able to get the property for, they're usually nonprofit groups that not a huge amount of money, and so they would like to be able to get the property for a small amount of money. Wiley, you've probably got the city and John Carroll. I don't know, but it does become it becomes very, very complicated. How long did it take us to sell Coventry?
Yes.
For $1. and people are still complaining about it. And then the various efforts to sell Milliken there's a lot of lore out there about that, but basically what has happened is over the years people make, they provide a letter, like a 1-paragraph letter, and says we're interested in paying X amount of money, and then of course it turns out, and people, that's not a contract, it's not binding. Ultimately they're not willing to pay that. At the most recent situation, pretty much the prospective buyer turned out to be insolvent. So they walked away from it. Anyway, it's not been easy to accomplish any of these sales, and definitely not lucrative. And I think you could also talk about how much did you save? I mean, as I recall, the dollars for closing Coventry were what, $1 million a year, or between $1 and $2 million a year, because you still have the same number of students. You still need staff, for that number of students.
Right. So yeah, in fact, there was a question that came to me recently about, about what the rule of thumb is for savings if you close a building. And I kind of posed that to George Petcack, because the comment was attributed to him. He said he really doesn't have a rule of thumb because he could tell us, for example, in any of the buildings we have, what the utility costs are annually. So he would be able to say, you're going to save X amount in utilities that you're not going to have to pay anymore if that building closes and we don't have to deal with it. But really the bulk of your savings is in staff. The problem being that depending on which building you closed and how many kids are there, you have to then redistribute the students, which may or may not require, staff to follow along with them. So although you may be able to, if you, for example, close an elementary school, you may not have a principal and a building secretary, maybe a cleaner or a custodian, but a lot of the teaching staff, the aides, particularly if there are staff that are attached to special needs students, end up all going along with. And then you have transportation costs that change as well. So, depending on which building is selected, that could actually increase your transportation costs by now having to transport students to different buildings.
Scott, what is the total transportation budget roughly?
That's a good question. I don't have it broken down for this by the total transportation cost, but let me get back to you on that. I can shoot a message real quick and find out, because we track it by, there's a certain dimension of the account code called function. So for example, you can find out how much of our cost is related to special ed or human resources or business services, but you can, and transportation is one of them. So I can get that number.
Okay. But let me back up. We can't solve the a $10 million operating deficit by selling buildings, because we can't use the money for operating. I can't imagine there's 10 million in transportation savings to be had or anywhere close. Is that
no? Correct.
And then the closing a building, Scott, you're not standing behind the 1 to 2 million, but the numbers that Kathy put out, rings a bell for me. That I had the number of $1 million in my head in operating costs as well. So I don't know where that came from, but it is something I think several of us have heard from somewhere in the district in the past. But even that's not anywhere near $9 or $10 million. So to my mind, even if we could sell Wiley and reduce transportation and close a building, we still need a levy. And
correct.
What? So you sent. I'm pulling up the mill model. I don't know if others took a look at that.
Yeah, I ran some numbers myself and played around with it a little bit. Sort of more with the focus on, and I don't know if this is a really acceptable. I kind of brought it up last week. Doing a mill model that would really kind of only get us through fiscal year 2022 instead of 2023, like we'd been talking about. And I don't know if you want me to go over my numbers or what, but I have them.
Yeah, Max, I think it makes sense. I also wanted to go over I did the same thing. I ran 2-year and 3-year numbers for both the levy model 2020 and the 2021. And it made the 2021 did not look attractive to me at all.
I didn't even do anything for 2021 because I think, as much as we would love to not have to put the levy on the ballot this year, that by delaying next year is going to exacerbate the problem, and I think that we will have less of a chance of passing a levy in 21, the amount of money that we'll need, we will even this year when it seems to have been unpopular.
Why don't I propose this? Why don't I share my screen and show the numbers that I came up with 2021, and then I'll stop and I'll let you look at 2020. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yeah, I can't. My Chrome is a little messed up. I am going to dial back in a second. Don't wait for me, okay?
Okay. So what I have on the screen is this is the tab that Scott sent us, and I've just added this column here over in column H. But Scott's calculation was that if we wait to pass a levy next year, and we are going for a 3-year cycle, his calculation was we have a deficit of 56 million to fill. We have about $16-17 million now, so the hole is roughly a little short of 40 million. 2.5 years of cash to get it. So he divides this by this to get 15 million, and then converting that to mils, it's 14.2 mils. So my thought was, well, what if we pass a levy next year, but we're not trying to get 3 full years? We only try to get 2 years. In other words, we're just trying to get through the end of, I think it would be fiscal 23. So that's what I ran here. Here I'm summing not all of these columns. I'm just summing through column E. And I'm doing the same thing here. So instead of a $56 million deficit, it's a $40 million deficit. And so the overall hole is 23 million. Now the problem is you don't have 2.5 years of collections. You just have 1.5. So it ends up being about 15.6 million per year, and your millage is 14.1. So any delay, ends up with a millage that's in double digits. It seems to me. I mean, even if you start going back to the 5-year forecast and trying to cut some things, and recall the 5-year forecast is not rich when it comes to, some of the salary and wage assumptions that are in here. And it does assume some cuts, as we saw last time. So after running these numbers, it really seemed to me that not going on the ballot this year and waiting a year would leave us with some really bad choices next year, going on potentially at double digits or going on at single digits, but the district making some really significant cuts.
Sorry, I'm kind of slow on the uptake. Did you have an example of a small levy that would be enough so that there wouldn't be a deficit until 2022?
So I think Max does.
Okay, all right.
For putting something on the ballot this year. So I was just showing the options about going on the ballot next year, and you're in double-digit millage almost no matter what you do. I mean, you'd have to make significant additional cuts just to get it down to a single mill ballot. I mean, it really puts you in a very rough financial position.
Understood.
So I don't know, Max, if you want to share your screen or just walk through the numbers.
Sure, I'll just walk through the numbers because I kind of I did the work and then kind of summed it, and the work is not there, but I could go through it if people want to at some point dig a little deeper into it. But basically the numbers that I ran, I kind of took a little bit of a different approach. It was, trying to end fiscal year 22, getting out of that deficit. And what I did is I just took the same models, went through it the same way that Ryan did. But then I just kind of, I played with the number that's that savings number. If you're looking at the 5-year forecast, there's that, it says cuts, minus $750,000. So I kind of just, I upped that little by little to see what the millage would be necessary to get us out of the hole for fiscal year 22. So if we up that to 1.25 million in savings, so that would be an additional $500,000 cuts in the first year, then it would be 5.3 mils would go on the levy this fall, and that would get us through 2022, fiscal year 2022. At 1.5 million in savings, that drops to 5.1 mils. And then, I was seeing like what it would take to the nice round number, 5 mils, that would 1.75 million in cuts in that first year. With 5 mils, we would have a levy that would cover through fiscal year 2022.
So Max, if you just assumed what was in the forecast, if you don't play with that at all, then the millage
Yeah.
is 5.6. Is that what we talked about last meeting?
Yeah, it was 5.6 last week when we talked about that. If there was no additional savings through the cuts, I just kind of upped that to see, what it would get to get it down to 5. If that's much more palatable for people, I don't really know, 5 versus 5.6, but also understanding that it's only going to get us through 22 and that another ballot is going to be necessary. But I think that there is just so much uncertainty. For me, I think waiting until next year is disastrous and should really, I don't think that we can dig ourselves out of that hole if we do that. But I think that this year, taking into consideration that there is a lot of uncertainty and people are nervous about, the values of their home and their income and all this other kind of stuff, that getting the mills down as far as possible while getting us through 2022 at least buys us enough time that we, hopefully in a year or two, we'll be in a position where the economy is stabilized a bit. Hopefully the HEROES Act or some version of the HEROES Act is passed. And there's an actual sort of safety net for people during the coronavirus time, and that we'll be able to have a franker and maybe hopefully better discussion. Maybe some legislation goes through in Columbus between now and then that we'll be able to have a better conversation with the public at that point. But right now, I think getting the millage down as far as possible and getting us through 2022, for me, seems to be a good middle ground that we can, I think, explain pretty well.
That's very, very interesting, the approach that you've used. When you say getting us through 2022, as a practical matter, does that mean putting a levy on the ballot in 21 or 22?
That I'm not sure. I mean, I'm trying to think about the calendar. I mean, it would likely require us to have to put another levy on the ballot next year. Is that right, Scott? Or I'm not entirely certain.
That is likely, yes. So we would have to look at I would have to look at the spreadsheet, but I would think that if we and again, depending on what we wanted the millage to be, but if we look at a levy that will get us to a positive balance in 22, we're it's going to reduce the balance also in 23. So it will be a matter of addressing that deficit now in 23 by either putting something on in 22 or depending on how much we want that subsequent levy's millage to be and what the cycle that one would be as well. So there are a bunch of different factors we would have to look at. But to Max's point, that certainly is a way to keep the millage down, but it would be a very short-term solution. Yeah.
We wouldn't have to be back on the ballot in 21, would we? I think that should give us till 22, I would think.
That's why I'm saying I think 22. Yeah, that's why it would appear to me it would probably be 22. It would just be a matter of how much millage that would be.
That would combine a smaller levy on the ballot this November, along with what would have to be a commitment on the part of the board to reduce expenses, right? Unless you go with the higher, the 5.6, and which 5.6, politically that right. would probably be attractive.
Well, let me throw, Scott, I don't know if you can share your screen. I'm happy to throw the mill model up. So let me.
Ryan, I'm still having some technical difficulties here. I'm able to see everything now, though.
So I think this is what this is what we were looking at last week. Can you guys see my spreadsheet now? I need something verbal.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So this is what Scott had in here. And this is, the calculation he provided us. And this is to get through a 3-year cycle. and that was where the 8.5 mils came, and it was a little higher than the 7.9. And I think we understand now from the beginning of this call why. But this, honestly, it's very similar to the math we were facing earlier last November. And, you know, we landed on, we wanted to get to a 3-year cycle, hopefully could stretch it to 4. And we, you know, our recommendation was between 7.9 and 9.5 mils. So honestly, you know, if we're on the 3-year cycle, we're making a recommendation very similar to the recommendation we made in November. This column G, shows the 2-year cycle, and I think this is what we were doing a little back of the envelope last time or on the fly, and that's the 5.6 mils. And then I think what Max is saying is he went in and just boosted this number to maybe 1.75, like so. Not sure why.
You have to make that a negative number, otherwise it goes the other way around. And actually, if you just enter the number in next to the word cuts in the cell directly to the right of the word cuts, then it automatically just does the calculation.
Well, let's do that. That was a 1.25. So if I flip back over the levy model, it changes to 5.3 and 8.1. And then I think you said the 1.750, which is still quite a bit of cuts. And we're talking about 5 mils or 7.8. So, you know, this is showing to me that even quite substantial cuts aren't moving the millage that much. Does anybody else want me to do anything with this spreadsheet?
I have a question.
Yeah.
When we're doing these mill models, are we taking into consideration the collection rate on that mill model? Are we already discounting it? Or are we assuming 100% collection rate?
No, I believe we're assuming it's like the 89%, right, Scott?
No, actually, the number there, that when the county certifies, they certify at 100%. So that's assuming.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so that's assuming 100% collection. Which, if you look at what we were talking about with our delinquent collections plus delinquent plus current. You know, in a given year, we can have 97, 96.4, 97.2, 95.04, 97.06. So, you know, that's definitely probably overestimating a little bit what we're going to get. But that's when the county certifies the number that we supply to them. When you offer the millage to the board in that first resolution, they come back and they'll certify 100% collection full millage amount.
Scott, I'm a little confused. I thought this 72,250 was in between the county's 89.6% and our 5-year trend.
It is. So what we actually have in the forecast is what we expect for what we currently receive is based on that trend number. But when the county is going to certify what a new levy would bring us, they're certifying at 100%. So if we want to be a little more conservative, we could go in and say, well, you know, no, we're going to see, you know, less than that, which would actually drive the millage request up. But that's the way we've traditionally done it. So the mill mods that we've used all through the years have always assumed 100% collection, even though we know that's not actually what we receive.
100% of the new money.
Of the new, of current, not of delinquent, correct.
And if nobody else wants to see anything here, I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
I'm good.
I'd love to make a comment. I really like the option to go with 2 years. And I think it's something that the board needs to see in your presentation on the 7th. I think you also need to you obviously need to talk about if it's going to be a 3-year. You also need to talk about, the double digits and how difficult that would be to make work if we were on the ballot next year. So I mean, I think if you can just sort of echo those comments, I think that would be, I think it would be very helpful for my peers to hear that.
Well,
I think we need to be careful not to call this a 2-year levy, because in the trade, that would be understood as essentially a temporary levy, so that it is instead a levy that is sized to anticipate a likely need for an additional levy in 2 years. Isn't that really what we're talking about?
Correct. Yes.
Well, I think we have a decision as a committee to make whether we want to recommend, the lower millage of the 5 to 6, or we recommend the higher millage, or whether we kind of say to the board, here are your 2 best options, and there's pros and cons to each, and kind of, leave it to the board to kind of choose one of those 2 directions. I'm probably in the latter camp. The board could choose the lesser millage now, but it would have to understand that if things in the forecast don't change for the better, you are going on the ballot sooner, or you have to be really ready to prepared to make more cuts than you would need to than if we had passed the levy with the higher millage. So, I mean, I think that's more of a political decision for the board. So I'm comfortable presenting both, but I want to hear from the other committee members whether they think we should whether they would prefer to point at one or the other.
I agree that I think those are the 2 options, and with one, I mean, if we put the larger levy on the ballot now and it fails, that will be catastrophic. And it's not a perfect solution to go with a lower amount and hope to be able to pass a bigger levy, in a relatively short amount of time. But I think it's up to the board to make the decision as, to look at the political situation and policy and what can happen to the district in either event, and for them to decide.
Yeah, I really don't have a strong opinion one way or the other about giving one recommendation or kind of giving both scenarios to the board. I can understand either way.
Quatrice, I don't know if you have a view.
I would say options would be better. Like if we, tell them like, here are the options and let them make the choice. I do have a question for you, Scott. A few years back, I don't know if we were looking at it for reasons of saving money. I know a few years back, the district was considering reconfiguring some of the schools, like maybe having a pre-K1 or a pre-K2 building, and then like a 3-4, a 5-6, blah, 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 so on and so forth. And, there was lots of feedback from the community and it seemed favorable. Was that something that the district was considering doing to save money at that time? Would it save money, or would it be a bigger cost to the district?
So I'll let Jim correct me if I'm wrong or jump in here, but the conversation at the time, you're right, that you were referring to was whether or not, in particular, when the middle schools were being remodeled, whether or not reconfiguration of grade levels would be advisable in that whole phase of the bond issue. So it was decided that the middle schools, it would be still a high school and a 6-7 middle school model with 2 middle schools. That's kind of where we are now. So I think phase 2 of the facilities plan that is happening currently is really talking about more what it would look like in terms of the number of elementary schools, and not necessarily grade reconfigurations. But Jim, I'll let you jump in there if you recall that differently.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the biggest issue is there's members of the community, the school community, that wanted to see basically an upper primary. So you go K through 4, 5-6 building which would be either Monticello or Roxborough Middle, and then a 7-8 building, which would be whatever building was not the upper elementary. So, and there was some thought that we'd be able to take Roxborough or Monticello, or possibly use Wiley and close Monticello or Roxborough and make those schools basically deal with 2 full grades. But if you do the count, the student count, you need more square footage in all those buildings to make that happen. So, I mean, it was hard for me to support. I mean, I think I love the idea from an operations perspective. But from a fiscal perspective, it would have cost us more money to make that happen. Just because we would have been essentially adding 1 full grade across 2 buildings, which we just didn't have. I mean, we just didn't do that. And we were already trying to make the best use of our available funds for the middle schools. We would have just been spread too thin. So.
Thank you.
So I think last time we talked about, you know, in our last presentation, the committee made kind of specific recommendations to the board. And, you know, I think I'd like to maybe talk about kind of what specific recommendation we want to make. And I think, you know, we have some leeway as far as how specific we want to make it. But I do think we need to make a strong recommendation that they go on the ballot with a levy in 2020. I mean, I think maybe the most important thing for them to hear is we understand the benefits of waiting, but there isn't a good. It seems to me the outcomes if you wait are all troublesome.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And then, you know, the second component of this is, you know, okay, well, we give you 2 options, and so I guess the question would be, you know, what are the millage? What is the millage within those 2 options? You know, I think the baseline numbers are 5.6 to get us through fiscal 22 and 8.5 to get us through fiscal 23 under the existing 5-year forecast. You know, you could make an argument to say, all right, well, you know, that's about 5.5 or 8.5. You know, the board could do, you know, our ranges could be 5 to 6 or 8 to 9. I don't know. I don't know if Scott has any expertise or thoughts on where we should go, or if others do. I'm spitballing to some extent as far as kind of how we build a range, but I mean, that's what I was thinking, is some sort of limited range around each of the 2 options.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, Ryan, the numbers, you know, those are your 2 baseline numbers. So if there's a range, and I don't know, maybe this would be a question for Jim, whether or not there's a wide range of numbers that are more advisable, or whether you do just go forward and say, look, here, if the 5-year forecast plays out as is predicted, you're 5.6 for 2 years, 8.5 for 3 years, unless you're willing to make some level of cuts, and then that's going to affect that millage one way, or, you know, and bring it down, and then just let the board have that conversation from there in terms of what combination of millage and cuts they're willing to do. So I'm not sure, Jim, if you have thoughts on how you would best, what the board would find to be the productive.
Well, okay, so I'm looking at the 5-year forecast, and I think what we're trying to do is honor the negotiating process and not try to. Okay, so a lot of our costs are based on what's negotiated with our unions, and we can't draw a ULP, unfair labor practice, by putting numbers in this 5-year forecast. I mean, so for example, if we think that we can just arbitrarily cut staff 5% or cut our costs 5% by going over everyone's pay by 5%, that theoretically can't go in the 5-year forecast. Because then we're going to be drawing a I mean, we're going to be negotiating through this document. What we're just showing is just no raises, so nothing more than what the union has right now. I mean, I think it's good to present options to us on what it would take to bring the levy down to something so it can pass. When you go to 5 mils, you know, my next inclination is, well, what if you bring it down to 4.9? I mean, that makes a big difference.
Jim buys things for $1.99, but not for $2, I think.
It's not that. I mean, you know, everybody's being straight up with the numbers and always have been. But I mean, when you do go between like a 4.9 or a 5 or a 7.9 and an 8, I mean, it shows intent that you're really trying to make it really as low as you possibly can.
But you know, I would say, Jim, you know, we were somewhat concerned last time because, right, we're solving for 0. So at the end of the fiscal year, you know, there's nothing there. you're down to 0. We were concerned last time about that impact. You know, and you know, again, finding another 750 every year gets tougher and tougher. So I mean, I do think that honestly that this 5-year forecast is more aggressive probably than the one as far as trying to keep cost savings down than the one we were looking at last fall, which just suggests that if you're trying to cut even more, it's just going to be tougher.
Scott, with the you know, with going from for the retirement from 35 down to 30, do you anticipate that we have several staff members coming up that would be eligible for retirement?
So what do you mean when you say that, Quatrice, in terms of going from 35 to 30?
So, you know, like the retirement system, the retirement change, not from 35 to 30, where they had to be a little older to retire. So now that, you know, some of the staff members are getting older and they've met that requirement, do you anticipate that more teachers, you know, people that are on a higher end of the pay scale are going to be retiring in the next couple of years? And I'm only thinking about, you know, the 750 each year that we are trying to shave off of the budget.
Yeah, so, you know, it's funny because the retirement system always works against us. So, you know, we even had some retirement incentives in previous contracts to try to incent people to leave so that we could then hire younger teachers that were less expensive. And then, of course, as you just said, STRS, you know, switched and said, oh, you know, now you have to have 35 years of experience instead of 30. So that really just kept people on our payroll much longer. And I've not seen a glut of retirements. And I think it's still, you know, and I think the economy in general is going to be working against us as well, because, you know, people are holding on to their jobs longer than they would have based on having insurance and, you know, just having, you know, the uncertainty of what will happen if they retire. So I don't know if Max probably has seen, you know, has a little experience with that too, in terms of seeing if there's an increase in retirements or not. But you're right, you know, we're always hopeful that $750,000 we have can be saved through retirements that we simply wouldn't replace rather than riffing employees. And I think we were able to do that this last time around with cuts. We had some retirements. We were able to just not replace those positions, and there weren't a lot of riffs that were necessary. But Max, I don't know if you are seeing that too or not.
I am. We're seeing it a lot, but I always kind of have to remind myself that, like, all right, it's nice to, you know, people are going to, you know, get out right now, and you're going to see like a little bit of savings right away by either not replacing that position or replacing them with a less senior person who's going to be lower on a step scale, for example. But, you know, ultimately long term, it just means that people are going to be working longer, you know, in the long run. So it's a nice, like, little bit of savings that you can make right off the bat. But, you know, less people do it than you would think, take advantage than you would think, because I mean, some people just like working, and ultimately it just means that people are going to have to work longer in the district, and you're going to get less of that turnover and less of that ability to kind of rely on people retiring at a certain age to hire, either not replace them or again hire them with somebody who's like lower on a step scale than they would have been.
This is more my curiosity, but I thought that the teachers, when they retired, qualified for a healthcare program under that was provided either through the union or through the state. Are you saying that the health care that they get on their retirement is sufficiently unattractive compared to what the district is providing, that becomes a deciding factor, as opposed to they just want to work longer to get more income?
I would anecdotally say that yes, you know, based on what I hear, and again, I would let others chime in on this, that yes, the retirement, the insurance that is through the retirement system is not nearly as, I mean, it's there, and it's great that it's there for retirees, but it's not great. So, you know, certainly I think that is a deciding factor that I hear from teachers who will say, you know, I'm not ready to make that leap because the insurance through the retirement system is not amazing compared to what they can get else, you know, if they continue to work.
You know, I just, that might be something to look into further, as when you say not great, do you mean it's like Medicare? I will stay off of it, but it's just that
yeah,
you know, it's a double expense if it means that you have an older workforce than you might otherwise, because of your generous benefit system.
Well, what it does too is, you know, remember that we're self-insured. So, you know, if you have you have an older group of employees, tend to have more claims as well. So, yeah, it's
that cost goes up also.
Correct. So I guess back to Ryan's initial question. You're muted, Ryan. Is what what do you do about a range or not a range, or what?
What if we set a target that we would say, all right, well, we're recommending either something around 5.6 if we're trying to get through fiscal year 22, or 8.5 if we're trying to get through fiscal year 23. But then we also illustrate that if the board believes it could make an additional, X amount of cuts, the millage would drop a certain level. And instead of, we could show, that if you cut X number of dollars, this would be the millage, and encourage the board to find reasonable cuts if they can. I mean, is that a palatable alternative? As opposed to a range? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah, and I do see Max has in the chat there, about the $2 million in cuts versus the 750 brings fiscal 23 down to 7.6 mils and fiscal 22 down to 4.8 mils.
I think in a presentation, we could make a recommendation, for the 2-year, the 2022 versus 2023. And maybe tighten up the range a little bit and just say, listen, between 4.8 and 5.6 mils or 5.8 mils, and that's it's contingent upon how much what kind of will the board has to make these cuts, and the ability for the board to find the cuts to make. and then in the 3-year, 7.6, which is if you're going to cut $2 million in the first year, then you could get it down to 7.6 to get us through 2023. But that's really, that's a heavy amount to cut, and it's still close to what was on the ballot last time that failed. But we could say minimum, 7.6 through 8.5, or 4.8 through 5.6, depending on where you want to, like how far in the cycle we can get.
I'm comfortable with that approach. Kathy, was that a thumbs up?
That was a thumbs up from Kat.
And Quatrice, would you be comfortable with that range of recommendations? I don't know that we formally vote, but if anybody's opposed, I'd ask them to speak up now. I mean, I'm willing to take the laboring org to try to put together a presentation for the board that kind of establishes the basis for these recommendations. I would intend to indicate that we looked at, we considered an income tax and rejected it for some of the reasons we talked about in the last meeting. I think since we've already done one of these recently, I would probably cut out a lot of the preliminary stuff that we had last time, and maybe add a little bit on the back end that discusses, what it would take to get down to the 4.8, and maybe some of, flesh out some of the things that Max had talked us through. So if you guys are okay with that, I'll circulate something once I have a draft. It's probably going to be after the holiday, so it'll be a pretty quick turnaround. And then solicit all sorts of comments.
You got it.
So, when is it that the recommendation needs to be presented? Is it July 7? Or which meeting of the board?
Yeah, I think the plan was that July 7th, unless, Jim, you tell me otherwise. I think that's the...
I think we need to have we need the presentation as soon as possible, and that would be the 7th. I'm unsure that, we haven't talked about this as a board, but I'd be surprised if we would be prepared to actually vote on it on the 7th. I think we're going to have to give it some thought and give thought to our constituents and just get a better handle on it. I think we need something we can start thinking about. So I think it's important that you're there on the 7th.
What time is that meeting on the 7th? I'm asking because I have a library board meeting that night as well.
It's at 7.
Starts at 7? Okay.
Yeah.
Max, I don't think you need to be there. I know you've got a lot of things on your agenda, the library agenda. So
okay, if you're okay with that, then yeah, there's some coming down with the library that we're gonna have to deal with as well. So.
Okay, well, I would just offer that, Ryan, if you as you're working through things, if you need any other data or you need anything from me, please feel free to let me know. I'm happy to help in any way.
Scott, I can tell you one of the things I would appreciate is maybe a what would it cost slide. I've done this myself in the past, but I always feel better when it's coming from if we're telling people how much this is going to cost them. I really like it to be buttoned down and done by the person who knows. So both at the 8.5 mil amount and the 5.6 mil amount. I guess I would ask for, and then that could be tweaked, either live by either one of us if the board has questions or wants to see other alternatives.
Absolutely, we'll do.
Hey, Scott, can I ask you to look at one other piece of data too for us? There was some concern by the levy opposition that Cleveland Heights would again be the highest property tax city in the state of Ohio. So, things have changed since the last election with other levies passing. Can you look at what it would be if we were to pass any of these, and we would indeed be the highest taxed municipality in the state?
Can do. I'll see if there's. I'll talk to our people and see if we can. If there's something somewhere that we can get a hold of. That's current.
Okay. Thank you.
Unfortunately, Jim, I know the answer for Cuyahoga County at least. Right now, both Garfield and Shaker have a higher tax burden than Cleveland Heights or University Heights. But if the levy passed, I do believe we would pass both of them as far as just the property tax goes. Doesn't take into account any differences in income tax or deductions, but just on a straight property tax basis. Then this is just based on the latest county. The county publishes a 2-pager, and that's just based on that.
I think somewhere, Ryan, there's a statewide one as well. So I'll see if I can find that.
Now at the smaller end, I think the highest the highest right now is for people that live in the city of Cleveland, but in the Shaker Heights School District. We might not, depending on the millage, we might end up below that. But I think that would be so it's a little unclear, whether we would leapfrog everybody. Based on the millage the board approves.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get a sense of, especially if the board were to agree, supposedly on the 5 mil levy or 4 million or something like that.
Can do. All right. Anything else for this afternoon or for the good of the order? Are we good?
I think we're good.
Thank you all so much for your time. Much appreciated. Like I said, any other data you need, please let me know. I'd be happy to get it together for you. Jim, anything else?
No, except thank you for y'all. I mean, it's a lot of numbers. So appreciate everybody's time.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much.
Check your emails, everyone. Something will be coming.
There you go. Thanks for doing that, Ryan. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.